are you asking me to give you an outcome that you want, or just to help you answer a question that you have? Those are two very different things. If it's to get an outcome that you want, that's activism masquerading as science. I was going to talk about something else today, but I stumbled over this, and it does bode some interesting things to think about. For those of you who may not be familiar, at least in the United States, and I believe in much of Europe as well, most scientific research funding comes from the respective governments, but also from foundations, foundation grants through private donors, and also from private businesses who do fund sometimes their own research and own research labs. But in a lot of cases, there's a significant portion of it, at least, that is government funded. And in particular, in the United States, a lot of that comes from the National Science Foundation. Now, that is another where science, how science is funded, because obviously we need money to do research. You have to pay salaries, you have to pay equipment, you have to pay all these other kinds of things. You have to figure out how to pay the bills to do the research you want to do. And that is, of course, where it, one of the big places where it intersects with other people and the desires that other people may have. And for this reason, there is often a lot of concerns about accountability. Particularly in the case of government dollars, there's questions about accountability with respect to the fact that you're doling out the money of the taxpayers. So it should be ultimately accountable to, in the United States, Congress. Congress and, well, yeah, particularly Congress, because Congress is the ultimate arm that pays the budget in the U.S. Constitution. That is the way it is laid out. And so for that reasons, there's desires to have accountability. Other reasons for issues of accountability come down to moral things, and I've talked a bit on this channel about the Belmont Report and how it came to be, and that it is, for all things social science, it is a good report to stick by, and a lot of the things that pop up with social emotional learning in schools, if it were done in a research context, would actually fall under the regulations and requirements of the Belmont Report and institutional review boards. That's a whole other conversation to have. But, of course, I was always thinking about ways to make things better and how to do that. And so this caught my attention from Nature. How research impact bonds could transform science funding. Current funding models have high risks and low accountability. Public-private partnerships offer a better way. I'm skeptical. I have read this already, and it's not too long, so we'll probably end up reading through all of it, but I do want to get to a particular section because there's one part of this in particular that gives you a reason why I would not be comfortable with this as someone who does research myself, but also I suspect numbers of others would not be comfortable, and it's not entirely the academic freedom argument, actually. Because on its face, when I read this, my kind of thought was it would be a bit of capitalism, free market kind of approach, which I would actually find of benefit if there was to figure out a good way to do that. A whole other question. But there's a different problem I see with it. So let's get into that. Written by Michael Hill. This is an opinion piece for Nature. As head of grant management at the Swiss National Science Foundation, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how grants are used to fund research through processes that have changed little since the 1940s. He's not wrong. It has not changed all that much since the 1940s, except for adding regulations and requirements and reporting and what have you. The actual process itself has not changed all that much. Funders award grants to the most promising proposals or on the basis of researchers or organizations' past achievements. To the most, or on the, yeah. Most promising proposals, this is a lot of times, so this is something that folks should realize. For someone who's a young scientist who's actually very fresh in their field, they obviously don't have a lot of proposals that they've written. They don't have a lot of papers that they've published, and yet they have to get grants to be able to do publications and papers and what have you. So it's a little bit of a fun challenge. What tends to happen is that when you finish your PhD, you go into what's called a postdoctoral program, and you end up working with a senior researcher to build up your credentials until you basically are doing it on your own at that point. And you may still work under that person for some time, those kinds of things. It just depends from there, how does that go? But that's what postdocs are generally for. They're short-term postdocs, but they're postdoctoral research positions, postdoctoral fellowships. They're basically saying you're fresh off your PhD. There's some other things you got to learn, and we recognize that you don't have, huge amounts of papers and things like that under your belt, unless you did a crap ton of work during your PhD where you published like 6 or 7 papers and got grant funding for yourself, which is possible. It does happen. These approaches assume that the recipient will do great research, but it's not very common, I should say, on that last point. Will do great research, but have no guarantees and limited accountability. The funder bears the full risk. That is not entirely the case with the United States. I know that. It's true the funder bears a significant portion of the risk, but there is a tremendous amount of reporting you typically have to do. And if you do make the mistake of screwing something up and not being honest in any of that reporting, that transitions it potentially quite into criminal cases. So don't say that there's no accountability. It's just a matter of if somebody thinks something's squirrely enough to go and try and exact that accountability. But again, not entirely wrong. It is often the funder that bears a lot of the risk of this. He is proposing another approach, which he calls the research impact bonds. These would be issued to support public-private partnerships that promise strong accountability, no risk to the funding organization, and a direct demonstration of impact. Now, this is where we're starting to get into my problem with this proposed idea. What do you mean by impact? Who is that determined by? Although as yet untested in academia, they would follow the same model as social impact bonds, which some governments use to achieve social policy goals. This is why I'm getting nervous about research impact bonds. For instance, say the Swiss government promises to pay up 1 million Swiss francs, 1.1 million US dollars, to service providers that achieve a measurable outcome, such as reducing illiteracy in a certain population by 5% within a specified number of years. A broker finds one or more service providers that think they can achieve this at a cost of, say, 900,000 francs, as well as investors who agree to pay the costs up front, thus taking on the risk of the project, for a potential 10% gain if successful. If the providers achieve their goals, the government pays 990,000 francs, 900,000 francs for the work, and 90,000 francs investment return. If the project does not succeed, the investors lose their money, but the government does not. So, the concept there, actually, I don't necessarily have a problem with, and here's the reason why, because it's a very different reason than what he's talking about here, is that when the March for Science started in 2017, there was work done after that, and surveying work done after that, specifically regarding the scientists themselves who attended and participated in the March for Science, and still do. Some of them still do anyway. What they found was that one of the primary reasons scientists had for participating in the March for Science was that they were afraid they were going to lose their funding from the government to do their research. It was one of the primary reasons, which is fair. And it is one of the reasons I have been more interested in seeing a diversification of that portfolio that pays for scientific research. It's just as a matter of risk, because yes, different government entities, different administrations do sometimes want different things to be the focus. That may not mean the entire research pool for a given discipline goes away, but it may very well mean that there's much less of it. It's a fly that flew right in front of me, excuse me. May mean that there's much less of it. And so, from the standpoint of being able to pay the bills and continue in your research, that was why some scientists ended up marching in the March for Science, is to maintain science funding from the federal government. That said, that's not necessarily sustainable long term to do that either. Not that this is necessarily immediately better either, because you're still ultimately getting paid by the government if the work is successful. But this is where we come back to the actual problem here that I have with this idea, is that what's successful? What do you mean by successful? What is the impact involved here? One criticism is that impact bonds represent the financialization of the public sector, in which policymaking is subordinate to the interests of the financial sector. But they enable governments or other funders to do what other models do not allow: separate and transfer risk. The UK Ministry of Justice, supported by the Big Lottery Fund, commissioned the world's first SIB, social impact bond, from 2010 to 2015 with an initiative in a prison in Peterborough. The initiative provided people who had received short sentences with financial or housing assistance, mental health services, and vocational training. This succeeded in reducing reoffending by 9%, exceeding its target of 7.5%, and paying its 17 investors a return of around 3% per year. Interesting, if true. The RIB model would work in a similar way. First, a public research funder asks for RIB proposals. Researchers suggest projects with defined hypotheses, plans, and outcomes. The outcomes must be precise and measurable. Using methodology X, we will determine within 5 years and with 99% reliability whether approach A or B is more effective at reducing child mortality in situation Y. The funder evaluates and selects the RIBs to be awarded. Investors analyze the proposal's risks, supported by a broker, and the funder's selection arguments incentivizing them to invest in the research. So, this is where I get concerned. Having it be precise and measurable, which with the increasing amount of postmodernism, I'm sure wouldn't go over well with with that side, but I do worry how much this opens up pushing for a specific outcome rather than figuring out what the truth is. And in that particular example with child mortality, well, what if neither one is successful? Does that still count as success? And if it doesn't count as success, well, then you've spent all that money. And in the same vein, specific outcomes, precise and measurable outcomes, I could see that working if it's delivering a data set. Or something like that. But that's not what research is necessarily involved in if we're talking about the purpose of science, which is getting at the truth. Recognize that we need funding to do all of that, yes. But getting at the truth is the telos of science. Not necessarily getting an outcome, a specific outcome that somebody wants. See, yes, using method X determined within 5 years and with 99% reliability whether A or B is more effective, well, if neither one's effective, and you don't necessarily have the freedom to go looking for what might be another more effective approach, or whether some combination be effective, yeah, I don't know about that, but I also wonder if something like this approach could push researchers into having to do specific outcomes that are desired by the funder. Which is to say, let us say in this particular example that's highlighted here, that the funder really, really believes, for whatever reason, that method A is more effective. And they want it to be shown that method A is more effective. What would happen in that situation? Would there be a push from the funder onto the researchers to say, yeah, we would really love it. Your research would be considered successful if you showed that this method A was successful, and that's how you'll get your return. Do you see where I'm going with this? That's what I mean by, what do you mean by impactful? What do you mean by something that is successful? In this case, that has to be really carefully defined if you want to go in that direction with research impact bonds, per se. But there's also some other notes here to be made. RIBs will not work for some types of research. For example, projects so innovative that investors balk at the risk, or purely speculative science. But those can be funded in other ways. Perhaps the biggest challenge could be concerns over academic freedom. Scientists might be leery of committing to specific research outcomes, preferring to experiment freely and change direction to follow promising leads. But many researchers already pre-register their projects, which commits them to a methodology. Yes, but not knowing exactly how it's done in Europe, I can't obviously comment on that, but you can also submit reports midstream when you're in the middle of funding to say to a funder, here, hey, I found this. I know this methodology isn't great to continue doing this. I need to go in this other direction. Are you okay with that? You're not formally and permanently committed to a methodology. But, demanding a specific outcome, and in particular a specific outcome that a funder wants, which is going to be the temptation, that would push you towards having a solidly committed methodology to go toward that particular direction and not be able to change it. And also, what are you going to say when there's caveats in this? Because a lot of research does come with caveats. There's this limitation, this limitation, this limitation, this limitation, this limitation on my research. Does something that's impactful mean there's, no limitations on the research, that it's, for lack of a better word, bulletproof? Or does it come to a point where you have too many limitations? Well, I don't think your research is impactful, so you're not going to get that 10% return. So, yeah, I would be extremely leery of it. And I guess my argument is more of an academic freedom argument, because I don't see that necessarily being the case, that you have to be committed, because you do end up, the whole proposal process, you do end up saying, I think we can answer this question by going about it this way. But it is often the case in the course of a research project that you find that methodology you originally thought was going to work, no, it's not going to work. So you've got to go back and figure out how to do it differently midstream in a project. And that is often involving a lot of going back and forth with the funder. So there's a growing body of literature on the best practices for designing pre-registered research that is flexible yet reliable. I am convinced the pre-registration culture will make impact bonds easier to implement in research than they have been in social services. Again, I don't like the idea of pre-registering research to find a very specific outcome, unless you're saying the outcome is I'm going to answer this question. But if the outcome is going to be I'm going to find this specific answer to this question, that's a problem. That would actually very much compromise integrity in research. Compromise, particularly the disinterestedness. That's actually what I would be concerned about here. The Mertonian norm of disinterestedness would get compromised in a lot of this on the part of the researcher and on the part of the scientific community as a whole. If you go down this route where there's that temptation, you'd have to have some pretty strict guardrails in place on the part of the funders, I would think. But I don't consider RIBs the entire future of research funding, but they should at least be part of it. Investors are increasingly interested in opportunities to seek profit while enacting their philanthropic values. Again, is this is why I know some who are leery of foundation grants. It's for the same reason. Are you asking me to give you an outcome that you want, or just to help you answer a question that you have? Those are two very different things. If it's to get an outcome that you want, that's activism masquerading as science. That's not scientific research. So, no. Not necessarily a good thing. Brokers could offer a risk balance fund of RIBs on a topic of interest such as cancer or climate change. They would be valuable for diversifying an investor's risk portfolio because they would not be subject to the same market fluctuations as stocks or bonds. For funders and scientists, RIBs would create new funding streams and incentivize impactful research. Again, what do you mean by impactful research? One of the principles of scientific inquiry is to ask a question of significance, but that doesn't mean it necessarily has all the most impactful things to society, per se. They could also, and not necessarily supportive of particular narratives that one group or organization funding may want either, but that's another thing. They could also enable public funders to support and improve research agendas financed by private investors. What the hell does that mean? The personal preferences of philanthropists have created many uncoordinated private foundations in research areas with little impact. Informed public funders could offer to merge and channel some of that money into more promising areas through research areas through RIBs. I hope that one day there will be a variety of RIB-like models to suit research and funding goals. For example, researchers could receive partial payment for partial success. Again, what do you mean by success? Funders and investors could share the risk, or the return on investment could grow on the basis of agreed conditions. In some cases, they could use smart contracts which pay out automatically once a data set is complete. RIBs could also be traded, allowing for international competition between funders who might currently hold a local monopoly. Most importantly, I hope that RIBs will spark innovation and lead to the diversification of research. I don't think necessarily this is the best way to go about getting that diversification in research funding. He's not necessarily wrong that there needs to be that. In fact, I kind of agree. There needs to be a diversification in sources of research funding and how we go about doing that, because I don't think long-term having that be nearly entirely funded by the government is sustainable. But this is still funding coming from the government. It's just that somebody else would be paying the bills up front. So I don't know that this is the best way to do it, and I definitely have lots of concerns about the temptation that would most definitely be there to push scientists to get a specific answer, a very specific outcome that is in favor of the funder and the funder's desired things to see, rather than actually doing what science is and its ultimate purpose meant to do, the pursuit of the truth. I don't know. I'm unsure of this one, but I thought you might find it interesting. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, let me not knock over the microphone, and I'm Adrian. May you stay curious, everybody.